Warning. Please be advised. Blind faith, singular loyalty to one politician is categorically not, all caps, NOT, not patriotism. This has been your quarterly friendly reminder that patriotism is about the people, not one individual political idol.
Good morning, Trumptopia. A special segment of the almost daily ZenCast. Hosted by the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's talk Trump.
Greetings and salutations, fellow human beings and other life forms. Thank you for tuning in. This is the almost daily ZenCast, and you're listening to a special segment known as Good Morning Trumptopia, a critical look at the state of Trumptopia, or the Trumptopian movement. First, before we begin, let me make something plain and simple. Let me be as absolutely clear as humanly possible. I do not hate Trump. Despite the endless casting of aspersions and false accusations to the contrary by individuals avoiding my critical questions, I assure you, I do not hate Trump. I don't hate anyone. When I coined the term Trumptopia, in the days immediately after that golden escalator moment when he announced before a crowd of hired extras, which has been confirmed, there was no organic rally that day. He hired a bunch of TV and film extras to stand around and create the image of a large, adoring crowd. In the days following, after having seen that, and after having known Trump as a TV personality, as a celebrity, as a shady businessman with many suspicious business dealings that have been investigated as a matter of public record, I coined the term Trumptopia not as a negative judgment, not as an insult, but simply as a way of differentiating between your basic, everyday, run-of-the-mill, traditional Republican and this new influx of enthusiasts and sycophants and blind faith followers attaching themselves to Trump. Now, I'm not saying that to be rude. I'm trying to describe the collective behavior of a group of people as I observed it in real time. I wanted to distinguish between basic Republicans and other people, Republicans or otherwise, that were pledging their personal loyalty to Trump. They deserved their own designation, in my mind, not as a way to mock or ridicule them, but simply to identify them and give it give it a name, so that it can be then discussed. What I've noticed over the years is that some of them, upon hearing the term or seeing me use it in writing, they seem to choose to get offended. And I get that. I mean, it's sort of par for the course. It's part of the territory. It comes with being a talking, ambulatory meat sack of blood and bone. Y'all love to mock and ridicule each other over the silliest things. That's not a vague accusation. That's a very simple reality that can be verified by a clear-eyed assessment of human cultural history. Mocking each other is a way in which a vast plurality, although not everyone, chooses to communicate their thoughts at one another. And so it's easily mistaken. When someone's clearly mocking you, it's usually obvious. But when one is conditioned to assume that those who disagree with you are incapable of doing anything other than mocking you, if you're going to assume that my go-to tactics are mock and ridicule, you're going to project and misinterpret just about anything and everything that I or someone like me might say. But I assure you that in my heart of hearts, I was truly and genuinely trying to say, this is a thing that is separate from other things. They are cultivating an ideological construct. In the early days, it was vague and ambiguous and amorphous. Amorphous? I don't know how to pronounce that word. At least I didn't just then. But it was vague and obtuse and mostly just about adoring Trump. It has evolved since then and has become its own specific, if not confusing and often self-contradictory, ideological construct and dogmatic belief system. Those of you who've been listening to the show for a long time, you will know, hopefully, you'll remember that I have very specific thoughts, concerns, and intellectual criticisms of ideological constructs, especially when elevated to the place of blind faith. But if you aren't aware of my opinion on that, that's fine. Put a pin in it. Grab one of those imaginary red push pins, put it up on the imaginary giant corkboard of the shared mental space we engage in. Speaking of which, I want to share something here as sort of yet another disclaimer. And I know, I disclaimer a lot. Some like to taunt me with the line from Shakespeare, "She doth protest too much." And I get that. That can be valid. If someone's really going out of their way to defend something, especially when no one is accusing them of it, it sounds suspicious. But I'm defending myself against that which I have been repeatedly and falsely accused, which I have every right to do. And I want to be clear about something as we engage in today's discussion of what's going on in Trumptopia. I am not here to mindlessly argue or emotionally fight. I'm not here to argue or fight. I'm not here to win. And by here, I mean this platform, the podcast you're listening to, and any of the other platforms upon which I share my thoughts in some form or another. Fighting and competing and winning are all fine and good. in sports ball. But this is life and politics. Those are two different things. Don't conflate them, but they do act concurrently sometimes. One impacts the other quite a bit. And in my opinion, humble as it may be, in life, there is no competition, except for where humanity insists on making it up. If I'm not here to argue and fight and win, what am I here for? I'm here to participate, engage in, and, there's a third thing, but I forgot what it was. I just like it when they come out in threes. To engage in, participate, and something. They don't always have to come in threes, but my brain is stuck. Let's just leave it at two. I'm here to engage in or participate in civilized public discourse. Now, there's a big difference between civilized public discourse and arguing, fighting to win. You will note, dear friends and listeners, that in politics, what is needed is civilized public discourse that builds consensus and achieves intelligent decision-making. But what is used, what is engaged in, what is actually done is fighting. What is promoted, what is talked about, what is celebrated is fighting. Curious. Things that make you go, So friends, I humbly invite you, whether you're new or a longtime listener, I humbly invite you to remind yourself and each other that we are not here to fight and win. We are here to solve the problems that we ourselves, collectively speaking as a species, created for ourselves. And I know, I get it. Individualism is super popular. Therefore, since everything and most people think of things in polemics and absolute black and white, good versus evil sort of terminology, then individualism must be good and collectivism must be evil. Malarkey, I say. The two are mutually co-creative and inseparable. We can celebrate our individualism and also responsibly engage in our collective responsibilities to each other. We can be both individualists and collectivists because transcending ideology, transcending ideological constructs is the path to solving the problems that those ideological constructs cause us to create through the limited thinking and the boundaries imposed on our minds by ideological constructs. So, public discourse, what does that mean? People want to just dismiss it. I'm like, everyone's participating in public discourse, but not everyone is engaging it with the same level of respect and intellectual integrity. Now, there's nothing wrong with shitposting and trolling, except that it becomes, very quickly devolves into gaslighting. And everyone generally agrees that gaslighting is horseshit. But I'm not here to say, ooh, bad trolling and shitposting. If you like shitposting and trolling, fine, engage in it. But realize, dear friends, that if you're going to engage in trolling and shitposting in a forum of public discourse where others are trying to engage in serious, civil, meaningful, productive public discourse towards solutions for the problems that we've created for ourselves, then basically you're choosing to just participate at the peanut gallery level, and you're going to get dismissed quite often if all of your argumentation is limited to shitposting and trolling and gaslighting. So what is going on in Trumptopia, friends? Let's take a serious look and talk about it. And let's not get caught up in the nonsense tropes of the us versus them conditioning that's clearly bombarding everyone on both sides of this particular wedge issue. We've got some questions that we want answered. One that I don't have an answer to yet, and I'm just throwing it out there for contemplation, is whatever happened to Q? It's curious that some Trumptopian GOP leadership politicians, which I use to disambiguate from the non-Trump GOP, right? Some politicians that have self-identified themselves as Trumptopian in their belief system have curiously, over the course of the past year, abandoned quietly or even publicly denounced Q. And I haven't seen any of the QAnon community sharing any new cryptic drop posts. Of course, I may just be missing out because I'm not trying to be at the center of that community myself. I do sort of just observe in the public forum what gets brought to the circles I have access to on the platforms that I sit on, right? That I engage in public discourse around. But there it is, a question. I mean no insinuation by it, but what has happened to Q? What happened to all the revelation that was coming down the pipe? What happened to the storm that was coming? What happened to the prophecy that Trump would be reinstated? There's been no, I haven't seen, I can't say, I should not say, I will not say, I stopped myself from saying that there has been no new information there. I'm just not aware of it. And I used to see it flow across my streams a little bit more regularly. Maybe I need to do a little more active digging around. But I have heard, quite curiously, I haven't been able to confirm it myself, and I'm not pretending that I have, but I have heard others in the forum of public discourse make the claim that Q has not been posting for about a year. I've seen others make the statement that Q was arguably that preacher guy that owned stake in the server farm that was hosting the websites from which Q content originated from, and that he is no longer doing it for whatever reasons. But I'm not making claims. I'm sharing with you things I've heard and asking the question, so whatever happened there? Now, Q merch is still selling, and people still waving QAnon flags and QAnon profile pictures and claiming that Q is still relevant. But the track record for me doesn't track that because although they say plenty of things that Q quote unquote predicted have been confirmed and verified, when I ask them for that list of things, I usually get told to fuck off and I don't get a list, or the list is of really weird things that I don't remember them talking about and that no one is arguing didn't happen. When people tell you they prophesied things and then they provide you a list of mundane things that no one didn't see coming and that no one's disputing happened organically without the need of prophecy, what are they doing? But I digress. Would love to find out more about that, friends. If you know or are aware of some information that would help answer that question, please, by all means, drop a comment and let me know. I'm intrigued. Let's take a quick music break. Let's contemplate the state of things 1 year after the end of the Trump administration, and then kick around some other thoughts, ideas, and discussion topic thingy-maboobles. Sometimes the words just run out, and all I'm trying to get to is the transition where I say, DJ Zed, take it away. Just gonna tease you with a portion of that track because you want to go check it out in its entirety over at soundcloud.com/Mr. Zeppo. Dive into the music of the Zeppoverse without all of my rambling about my thinky thoughts, and support the content creation over there. I humbly invite you. So let's snap back to what's going on with Trumptopia. It concerns me greatly, this new level of goalpost shifting, self-contradictory denialism that I see being spoken and written in the spheres of public discourse by both the Trump GOP political leadership in office and some of the more vociferous, is that the right word I want? The more vocal and enthusiastic supporters in the voting bloc. Don't get me wrong. First things first, before we move on. Just because I'm criticizing Trump here in this segment does not mean I'm a blind faith loyalist to Biden. And that's an assumption that gets projected on me so much, I must constantly stand to correct it. I have made my opinion about the left quite clear. Now, the reason I have a special segment about the Trumptopian right is because I find my concerns regarding their rhetoric and their dogma and the direction they want to take things much more alarming, much more urgent, much more pressing than the redonkulousness that the left is involved. And to be really clear, I'm one of the early adopters, if not actually the person that coined the hashtag 2 wings, 1 bird. But put a pin in that up on the cork board. I've discussed it at length in various episodes before, and I'm sure we'll discuss it again. the denialism, the historical revisionism that is rampant in the Trump GOP. And it's like a feedback loop between the leadership in office and the most hardcore and rabid of the base. And another disclaimer, I understand that the Trump base is not a monolith of absolute singularity. No human endeavor, organization, group, tribe, etc. is ever an absolute monolith of anything. Curiously, the left gets attacked by the right, both Trumptopian and otherwise, in absolute monolithic terms of pure evil. But put a pin in that. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. I get that there is a wide range of diversity of opinion about what is and is not going on within the realm of the Trumptopian ideology, about the Trumptopian ideology, right? The Trump base, of course, has a wide range of supporters that support Trump for a wide range of reasons. But tragically, they also have a lot in common, and that's that if they are not, one of the most critical and alarming things right now is that they are either engaging in deep denialism and historical revisionism, or they are abiding by it, turning a blind eye to it, doing mental gymnastics and bending themselves into pretzels into rationalizing it away, and not taking any responsibility for holding their compatriots in Trumptopianism responsible for it. And it's complicated, I know, because they're in denial about a lot of things in a bunch of different directions. They're in denial about the way Trump handled COVID. They're in denial about what they think COVID is. Real, not real, a hoax, a robot. They're in denial about what Trump actually did versus what Trump says he did. They're in denial about the reality that Trump lost the election, but they're doing it in such a weird, bifurcated way that they're not even acknowledging each other's variances, each other's differences, each other's contradictory claims of absolute truth. And that's why it matters. Because when you speak to them one-on-one, as I do, real people, I'm not parroting what the talking heads on the left say. I'm basing my analysis of the Trumptopian phenomena based on Trump's own actual words. The words coming out of the mouth of the politicians in office that pledge their loyalty to Trump, and the real world people that I engage with in social discourse and have conversations about these concerns. And I am seeing this fractured cacophony of irreconcilable differences that they turn a blind eye to, that achieves the revisionist goal of no one in that party taking a stand to hold their party accountable. Right now, the fixation is about election fraud. And the wide-ranging, mismatching, incongruent set of rationalizations about what Trump means what Trump's status is, what Trump is going to do next. It's deeply alarming because ultimately an ideological tribe bears the burden of holding its own tribe and its own people accountable. Otherwise, it's too easy to dismiss. Like when you don't hold your own group accountable, other groups will try to hold that group accountable. And people will dismiss those attempts, labeling them oppression, bias, Trump derangement syndrome, etc. Now, I, have long held the belief, long before Trump, that if a politician's base cannot tolerate the intellectual, political, ideological critique of their chosen political idol, they should really question why, or move to a place where that sort of thing is illegal. Because the last time I checked, politics and politicians are meant to be held to account by the people. Now, delightfully, that's what the Trumptopian movement believes Trump is doing. I alone can fix it. But did he fix anything? If he was so genuinely concerned that there would be election fraud before the election, why didn't he do any real activities to fix it? Just like, this is another question that I can't seem to get a clean, straight, and consistent answer about from the sampling of Trump supporters that I ask it to. If Trump was truly going to drain the swamp, why didn't he? In real time, I called out that what Trump was doing was filling the swamp with more of the exact same kinds of political puppets that the Trump base is angry about to begin with. Trump appointees, especially year one, he was just stocking the swamp with more monsters, bringing in corporate CEOs and just big corporate players, which is exactly the problem that he was complaining about. Similarly, what was his biggest campaign promise that he never delivered on? Which, frankly, I consider that one of the single strongest bits of evidence that he was gaslighting and trolling and scamming the political base that he attracted from the beginning. Lock her up. Lock her up. He chanted. The chant was mesmerizing. I'm always deeply suspicious of political chants, because what do you call it when you repeat a propaganda item over and over and over again? I think the word is conditioning. So, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. But he didn't. And it wasn't that the big, dark, scary deep state fought him on the issue and stopped him. Any review of presidential documents in the archive have it been reported out before, but dismissed as just fake news. But this is the archive we're talking about. There was no real known effort. He did a lot of weird things. I mean, he fired people who wouldn't do things he wanted to get done, and installed people, sycophants, to try and get those things done. But on that list of crazy, weird things that he tried to do, and that he shuffled people around to try to make it easier to achieve, none of them is arrest Hillary Clinton and lock her up in jail. He made a lot of noise. He made a lot of political hay. You know what making hay is, right? Old saying. Look it up. For 4 long years, it was on the verge of happening. The goalposts would shift, the base would turn a blind eye, and just keep chanting it at the rallies. I'm sure, although I was not in attendance, but if I were to review the full footage, I would not be surprised. And this is speculation, because I always try to be self-aware and declare when I'm being speculative. This is one of those moments. But I would speculate and say that at his most recent rally in Arizona, there was probably at least one or more instances of "lock her up" being chanted. What does it say about Donald Trump that for 4 years he got the base to chant that saying over and over and over and over, like some sort of Pavlovian conditioning, and then he did absolutely nothing about it? I don't know about you, but to me, especially given the rest of the abundant factual evidence of his insincere, misleading words and actions, it just seems like pretty serious evidence that he has and always, continues to be just another politician, which, he's supposed to not be. And the thing with politicians is that whether they intended to become this or not, the system gets its hooks in them and they become political puppets. If the fact that he'd never even lifted a finger in the direction of actually arresting Hillary Clinton does not prove that he's a con man by nature and by practice, I don't know what else could, except for all of his endless fundraising. Now, these observations about him that I make are based on my own real-time assessment of his own words and actions, supported by the facts as can be found in public record, right? I get it. The talking heads on the news are going to spin the spin and they're going to exaggerate the exaggerations. That's pretty painfully obvious. I've been observing the mainstream media devolve to where it's at now for the last 30 years. And I'm not a hook, line, and sinker blind faith believer in the news. There's a spectrum of corruption. But it's also no news agency is 100% corrupt and evil, because no human endeavor, no human group, no human activity is ever absolutely monolithically anything. Have you met humans? No human individual is absolutely monolithically anything, any one thing. Even those that kind of seem like it because they're really dull or really stoic or really flat in affect, externally, human individuals by nature are deeply complex, nuanced, and complicated creatures. They all struggle to be as simple as they perceive themselves as needing to be, but that's a whole nother issue. As an observer of politics, my concern as we get closer and closer to the midterm election cycle, and then, of course, we're already, in the throes of it, but the opening act anyways, the 2024 election, is that if the Trumptopian movement doesn't open its eyes to its own nonsense, then the fight's going to be unnecessarily difficult, politically speaking, right? Because politics is about a fight. You got to win. You got to win elections to mean anything in politics. It's kind of astounding. Trump might very well be setting some new record. He's the first politician that has lost as much losing as he has lost in the last 5 years and still retains a strong enough political base of admirers to have impact in the political playfield, right? I mean, the reason the GOP has transformed into the Trumptopian GOP is because these political puppet players fear the power and sway and influence that Trump seems to be retaining over the voter base they rely on. They fear getting primaried out of a job by the Trump support mechanism. Luckily for American politics, there are some people and it's one of the least likely persons I would have guessed would step up like this. But Liz Cheney and others, and there's a growing number of people abdicating their affiliation to Trump. The most recent, let me pull up his name because I have a note about it. This is as prepared as I ever get. In terms of scripting things, because this is not a scripted show, friends. This show is real, raw, and radically unscripted. Where is... so sometimes sometimes this happens, and I can't find the thing I wanted to share with you. I know it's here, though. Maybe I'm thinking of something I posted on Facebook then, because my brain is... I'm trying to think of a name, and I can't find it. Maybe it needs to be looked up over here. Please bear with me one moment, dear friends and listeners, and let me take this moment to ramble about something else at you. Please, I humbly invite you to consider visiting solo.to/Mr. Zeppo, where you can dive into the various bandwidths of the Zeppoverse. Go check it out. Support the weird content and performance art I create for your entertainment and intellectual consideration. I found the thing. This is just one example. This just happened in the last 24 hours. But Dustin Stockton, someone half the Trump base has probably never heard of, but curiously would have blindly supported and cheered if they'd heard speak at a Trump rally up until recently. Dustin Stockton, one of the many core organizers of the January 6th events, because there were multiple groups organizing multiple staging events of different kinds and qualities. He is making the rounds, speaking out and denouncing Trump. I was watching one of several interviews I've noticed he's been, engaging in recently, and he was asked point blank, would you vote for Trump again? And he said, nope. And I'm paraphrasing severely here because I don't have notes in front of me about what he said. But he made it clear that after participating in organizing the events of January 6th and the fallout from everything that happened on January 6th of last year, he's come to the realization that he had been misled, manipulated, and lied to by the Trump administration, and that he can no longer stomach supporting him. Now, I said a long time ago on this show, very early on in the administrative cycle, while Trump was in office, that I was seeing signs of people realizing they'd been conned. It was happening as early as was it Carrier air conditioning? Remember that phenomena? He made a bunch of claims which within weeks panned out to be very misleading about saving a bunch of Carrier air conditioning manufacturing jobs. Mostly because although they held a press conference and Trump spoke and he, claimed to have saved the company just eliminated an almost equal number of jobs that they were about to eliminate that Trump supposedly saved from a different location. Something to that effect. I think they offshored a different factory and all the jobs with it. Something to that effect. So there's been a slow and steady drip, drip, drip of people going, that's, wow, I can't buy into this anymore. And then walking away. And I am of the humble opinion that these folks need to be heard by those who remain attached to and continue to give their power of belief to the Trumptopian movement. So, anything and everything that anybody in the broad coalition of those of us who are concerned that Trump is more dangerous than his adoring base is willing to admit, right? We need to keep gently and compassionately nudging these folks towards this water. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink, right? You can share the facts, but you can't force them to understand what it means about their loyalty to Trump. But this is getting urgent because of what where is it? Where's that other? I just had another document. I've got different places I'm looking at for my thoughts here, and now, okay, let me be clear. When I speak about politics and voting and the importance thereof. I speak about it from a perspective that needs to be understood in order for, my reasoning to make sense. My perspective is not that of a statist. I often get accused of being a statist by people who have not bothered to do a little bit of due diligence and look beyond the 1 or 2 or 3 posts they've noticed before they make that accusation. For the record, I made the meme, statism is the most dangerous religion in the world, with a picture of a presidential inauguration at the White House, or at the Capitol building. I'm not a statist. I'm not interested in becoming a statist. I don't support statism. I do, despite having made that claim, acknowledge and realize and understand that we live inside of this system of government. That if it were to disappear tomorrow, even the people that have lived with the prayer and the wish and the desperate thought that it would just magically disappear tomorrow would be a little shocked and a little fucked up by it. Because everything is interconnected, right? The system of government, the system of economics, etc. Now, I have to be clear. I am of the opinion, for whatever it's worth to you, to your friends and listeners, that these systems are imaginary. Humanity invented, made up out of thin air, the ideological constructs that create these systems, that these systems are comprised of. From currency to the laws of economics, made up. They do not exist in nature. This is important for many reasons. Put a pin in it. We've discussed it before. We'll come back full circle and talk it again. If they are made up, if humanity invented them, then, ergo, it is reasonable to conclude that humanity can change them, can radically reform them, and can do so without any undue allegiance to their, the necessity of their existence. But if we are going to do that, we must do so mindfully. And we must do so in a way that is not more toxic than the system itself. When a cure is worse than the disease, you've got a problem. Right? And I'm speaking about politics here. I'm not going to go off on any other tangents, although I realize the synergy and the resonance there. Put a pin in all of that. Leave it on the board for now. Many people who support Trump also, it appears, seem to think that voting, quote, does not matter because it's totally rigged. But they fail to realize that if that is true, then Trump's first election was also totally rigged. Because if it's that totally rigged, then Trump was in on it from the beginning. Despite all his claims, summarized and contained by his bold assertion that I alone can fix it all, which he clearly didn't, right? Like, did he fix all the problems with the American government? No. In fact, many of the things he achieved made some shit worse. I'm looking at the joy in the post office. And that isn't theoretical. That isn't a made-up leftist conspiracy theory. The post office is measurably and tangibly worse off and more dysfunctional than it ever was in recent living memory, before Trump installed that Yahoo DeJoy, and DeJoy did all those ridiculous and obviously destructive things to the post office. If a Democrat had done it, the Republicans would have been outraged. But then again, it's pretty obvious that politically speaking, the leadership of the Republican Party is perpetually outraged at anything and everything that Democrats do, because that's easier than actually engaging in civic discourse about policy. One of the things that Trump's influence over the party has rendered is that the party no longer has any tangible, meaningful policy platform items. There's just no platform anymore. And I know the left echo chamber is talking about that. Now, the problem, that happens is people will assume anything that's said by their opposition is a hoax. And therefore, if I say it, then I must be part of the hoax. But I came to that conclusion long before its current trendingness because it was self-evident in real time. There's another weird, curious trend that for some reason Russia has really benefited by a lot of the changes that have evolved over the last 5 years. But that's a whole nother episode. Put a pin in that. In terms of American political process, the following are things that Trump's GOP has factually and literally done. These are not leftist conspiracy theories. These are verifiable in public documentation. They have eviscerated the original Voting Rights Act while co-opting Martin Luther King's language and talking about the character instead of color issue. And by eviscerating the Voting Rights Act in the way in which they did, and I don't know, is this a coincidence? But they most dramatically impacted voters of color. As if that wasn't outrageous enough, they've blocked all the other attempts to establish equal voting rights at any level, federal or state. But it's being especially highlighted by their obstructionism of the two new voting rights bills, one of which is in honor of John Lewis. According to the base, regurgitating the talking points presented to them by Fox News and OAN and Newsmax and Breitbart, these voting rights bills are an evil satanic power play. Okay. Ensuring that people have equal access to the voting booth is evil and satanic. Explain that one to me. Curiously, lots of people in the conspiracy theory community, and I'm not saying it's one monolithic whole, but there is a lot of Venn diagram overlap with the Trumptopian base there. They will scream from the rooftops that voting doesn't matter, as I was mentioning earlier. Curiously, though, the Trump GOP has been hard at work over the last couple of years to enact new legislation in 20 Republican-led states to restrict or curtail voting access. In Texas, they're pulling drop boxes. So the largest municipality in Texas now has one drop box. That's not a conspiracy theory from the left. That actually happened, and it makes 0 sense. Now, long before Trump came around, people have been fighting over whether or not voting in America was legitimate. And there's this wonderful, and this goes this far back. There's a Mark Twain quote. And I don't have the meme I made about it in front of me, and I should if I'm going to reference it, but I don't. I don't remember where it's sitting on the internets right now. I think it's over on one of my pages for the show, maybe. I'm not going to look it up. But there's a quote, there's a Mark Twain quote. If voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. And I made a meme where Mr. Zeppo, my character from the books that I'm writing, retorts, then why are they trying so hard to block so many people from voting? This is why I warn people about the hoax, everything's a hoax mentality, right? Once you start dismissing everything as a hoax, then what is real? And it's been a long-standing debate, and this hoax mentality is being applied to everything about voting. And this doesn't come from out of nowhere. It's curiously coming from the Trumptopian GOP leadership in office. Voting's a hoax, so vote me into office, they seem to be saying. Voting's a hoax, so vote me into office, and then let's enact legislation that laser-focused targets communities of color and restricts their access to voting. Bullshit. I call bullshit on all of the pretzel-making rationalizations around that. Stop the Steal was a scam to quote-unquote fundraise. Trump has lost 60 legal cases in a court system he hand-select and packed with supposedly friendly judges. Why would that be? Is that how the deep state works? You pack the court system with judges loyal to you, and then they reject your cases? No, maybe, just maybe, all those cases were lost because of the merits of the case that Trump brought. That's a thought I would love, dear friends, to have printed out in paper right here in front of me all of the legal briefs from cases Trump has brought against others, so that I can compare them to the same kind of documentation from the legal cases that are being brought against Trump. That would be a really insightful and interesting and eye-opening compare and contrast analysis. Tragically, while those things are technically a matter of public record and available to anyone with the time and energy and resources to gather them all, I have not been able to. But I'm just putting it out there. It would be fascinating to compare and contrast. From the samplings of these documents that I have been able to dip into, I can make this speculative statement. Trump is a litigious con man that uses aggressive but deeply flawed lawsuits to try and mitigate the negative impact of his own conning of people. You just have to look back into the history of him suing contractors he shorted, and stiffed money on for his own casinos and whatnot. He preemptively sues people using arguments that have zero merit, but are all about casting aspersions and projecting onto the victims of the lawsuit. It doesn't matter if he wins in court, as long as he gets the talking points he gets to say about suing them. He gets his base riled up into a frenzy. How many times has Trump and the Trump chorus of sycophants claimed that they are on the verge of revealing this absolutely undeniable collection of evidence? And yet a year later, 60 cases have been lost in a court system packed with Trump-friendly judges. His most recent loss is actually a pretty serious one, and it's adorable how the Trump base, both the politicians and the supporters, are just dismissing it out of hand as if it's irrelevant and means nothing. The Presidential Archive finally gets to do its job and provide all these documents which Trump just spent a year fighting against being released. I'm sure he'll turn around now and say that they're meaningless and they prove nothing, but why then did he spend a year fighting them, using ridiculous arguments that anyone with a cursory understanding of presidential privilege knows were ridiculous and without merit? The only person that can declare executive privilege is the sitting president of the United States. To the best of my understanding, it is the sitting president of the United States that extends presidential privilege to past presidencies until the need is shown otherwise, as has occurred and been confirmed by multiple lawsuits lost by Team Trump. So brace yourselves. Now, the entire 1-6 committee is dismissed out of hand as illegitimate, as nothing but political theater, as a political witch hunt. I don't know about you, and I know that this is a weak argument, but it's funny how the other side uses it a lot too, until they don't, because then when it doesn't work in their favor, they don't want to hear about it. But if the Trump administration et al. Were free of any incriminating guilt, why have they fought it so hard? Why haven't they just marched in there and proven them wrong? Instead, they've played classic run out the clock, delay, and distract strategies in the legal sense, right? Like, that's the kind of tactics they've been deploying for a year now. And that gambit lost over and over and over and over again. Now, people will say, oh, but the court system's corrupt. Yeah, obviously. There's corruption everywhere you look, friend. Right? And arguably, Trump packed the court with Trump-friendly judges was itself an act of corruption. Curiously, they're very proud of that. But never mind the contradictions there. The reality is no human individual is 100% virtuous and pure. Every human is a messy, squishy, mixed-up bag of good, bad, and indifferent, and mediocre, and incompetent. right? We all have similar flaws. We all bear the same burden of responsibility to live up to the best of our ability, to doing things the right way, to doing the right things, and to holding ourselves and each other accountable. Is that achieved by mindless ideological fighting? I've never seen that happen. Is that achieved by civilized public discourse? Arguably, it can. Because if we engage in civilized public discourse, where we compare and contrast the facts on the ground, as opposed to argue and fight over dogmatic ideology, we can build a consensus about what is real, instead of passionately fighting past each other about what the absolute truth is. If there's one absolute truth, it is that there is no such thing as absolute truth. Put a pin in that subject, though. There are many of us who tried to warn the Trumptopian base, not because we irrationally hate Trump, but because we see past his manipulative lies and exaggerations. We tried to warn the base that he's a lying snake, oil salesman, con man, political puppet. And if I may address the Trump political base directly, y'all just ignored us. And then, after he was in office, and we pointed out to you how shady he was behaving, and doing weird things that didn't make sense, and failing to live up to his political promises, y'all called us deranged. And now that his scams and fraudulent schemes are being exposed with concrete fact-based evidence, y'all are deep in denial and mad at us for calling out his bullshit. And so I say with compassion and unconditional love to anyone willing to hear me, I'm sorry that happened to you. Own up to it. Stop blindly pledging your allegiance to someone that is no better than the people you vilify on the other side. Oh, and also stop hyper-vilifying everyone you disagree with. As I've pointed out before, and I'll point out again, and this is something that applies to everyone on all sides of every ideological argument. If you vilify the opposition, what makes you different from the villains that vilify you? I ask that over and over again. Because that shit matters. And because the system uses manipulative content into seducing people on all sides of every wedge issue into hyper-vilifying the opposition in order to dehumanize the opposition, in order to dismiss the opposition, in order to ignore the opposition. Because people want to win. And if you just turn the opposition into evil Satan worshipers, it becomes easier to objectify and dehumanize and therefore do anything against the opposition in order to receive a perceived win. What the world needs is healing, collaboration, consensus building, and species-wide collective comprehension of reality. It does not need winning ideological political parties to win. If I may be so bold as to suggest that. This is why I see that some people out there are projecting adversaries where there are none. I think I'm going to make a meme that's going to say, some y'all be projecting adversaries where there are none, and it shows. Trump, as a political idol, as someone demanding your direct, personal pledge of loyalty, and that's not a conspiracy theory, we've heard him say it. And his actions prove it. He wants direct personal loyalty from the politicians currying for his favor and from his base. And that, dear friends, is not patriotism. That is not what makes someone a patriot. Patriotism is an allegiance to your fellow citizens, not your political party and not a chosen idol. The coming months, we will see several things play out, right? And I'm not making predictions. I don't claim to make predictions. See my disclaimer about that in the disclaimer episodes and in recent episodes. I don't pretend to make predictions. And I always kind of giggle at the conspiracy theory community claiming that they predicted this, when all they really were doing was regurgitating content spoon-fed to them by algorithms that are obviously owned by the system of oppression, which they claim to be exposing. But I do think it's reasonable to speculate that in the coming months, we're going to see two different sets of events play out. One being the tactical strategery of the Trump GOP as it prepares itself to try and triumphantly reclaim control over 2/3 of the three branches of government. Historically speaking, that's the most likely thing to happen, independent of who is ever in office, right? Whether it was Donald Trump or some other Republican had won, or whether a Democrat. I mean, historically speaking, it doesn't matter which party controls the White House. In the first midterm elections, the opposition party tends to regain control and dominate both houses of Congress. And I said three branches of government, and I obviously misspoke, because the third branch of government is the judicial. And there, we've already got the whole Trump judge stuffing phenomena. That one sways a little bit more evenly and in alignment with the White House because, as many people may have already noted, Biden has been, of course, appointing judges to vacancies like crazy. So forgive me for misspeaking like I did just there. The opposition party almost always reclaims control over the two houses of Congress on a midterm. And while I will consistently maintain my critique that the two parties are complicit with each other, their complicity is entirely couched in and reliant on the optics of fighting against each other. So, the Biden administration and the Democrats are going to make a lot of hoopla about midterm elections. The question is, will they manage to do what they seem to always do right when you think they're going to get a big win? And that's fumble the ball and hand it to Lucy and have Lucy pull it from out underneath their kick. It's a bad Charlie Brown analogy, but it also kind of works. Consistently, since Reagan was in office, the two parties have vocally, vociferously, foaming at the mouth, fought each other tooth and nail, clawing at each other's jugulars. And yet, somehow, mysteriously, they each somehow manage to fail at stopping the other from achieving the evil things that they're trying to do. And that cuts both ways, folks. The Democrats just keep failing at preventing the Republicans from getting away with the majority of the scary things they want to get away with. And the Republicans, despite being way over the top in their vilification of the Democrats, also seem to magically fail to really stop them from achieving the things they want to achieve. And while there is indeed a turbulent pendulum swinging back and forth in terms of the resulting policies that get enacted, there's also this middle ground where these achievements are somehow curiously not canceled out by each other's agenda, not canceled out by each other's achievements. Like I said at the beginning of the show, and I'll say again, I'm not here to argue or fight. I am here to engage and participate in public discourse for the purposes of building consensus based on reality. There is a huge difference between those two tactics. Some people get it and some people just want to fight. I'm not here to be a tyrant and say, "Thou shalt not fight." I'm just here to encourage everyone foaming at the mouth for a political fight, and more importantly, everyone foaming at the mouth for a physical fight, to question why. Especially if they're fucking waving that "I question everything" banner. Because a lot of people claim critical reasoning and critical thinking until the questions start flowing. And then they just resort to tribalism and playground bullying and patting themselves on the back for owning the opposition. Because they want to win the fight instead of build understanding and consensus based on reality so that we can actually solve the problems we created for ourselves. So I say to those listening out there that might be part of the coalition to stop the Trumptopian movement. As flawed as the Democrats are, we must deal with the system as it operates now. Voting seems to matter. I know that it's really difficult to make that statement now for many reasons. And I know that many on the right will just laugh at that statement. But as I was discussing in the earliest days of this project back when it was a YouTube video series, and I made a really weird analogy by playing with food on a plate because this idea hit me in the middle of a meal. But if this community that calls itself the United States of America wants to stop the toxicity of the toxicity of the Trumptopian movement, there must be a influx, a flooding of the system by people who are legally qualified to vote. Now, the most nonsensical accusation on the right about voting that Trump made up out of whole cloth is that illegal aliens are allowed to vote. Bullshit. They're not. Neither are resident aliens with green cards. They're not allowed to vote. They never have been. Those claims have been pure bullshit up until just now, because apparently, and I haven't been able to dig much deeper into this besides the headline, which I heard on the radio while heading out to run errands, but apparently somewhere, and I think it was out of New York, some Democratic legislation wants to try and give future tense green card carriers and illegal immigrants the right to vote. I would totally oppose that, which is kind of ironic if you think about it, because I am a green card carrying permanent legal resident of this country. And I love it. I love it the way Randy Newman loves LA. In fact, there should be a version of the song that says, "I love USA," that sounds just like it, with the same rhythms, because it rocks so good. But I digress. As someone that is not allowed to vote in this country, I would assure you that I would oppose, to the best of my ability, the Democrats trying to pass a law that grants me access that way. Because it doesn't make sense, and it gives credence, it gives credibility to the hitherto completely false and irrational claims coming out of the Trumptopian right. But that's another example of how, the Democratic Party, because the base is, just like I've acknowledged about the Trumptopian base, widely diverse and not in 100% alignment with its leadership, as clearly evidenced by Biden's exceptionally low approval rating. But I digress. The Democratic Party has this bizarre proclivity to flounder and flop at defending itself against false claims, and then somehow turning those false claims into true claims occasionally, which does them no favors in the eyes of all those who hate the Democrats. And let's just end on this irony, since I just brought up the issue of hate again. It's really bizarre, slightly adorable, but also very disconcerting when Trump supporters on the right accuse, in absolutist terms, everyone on the left of hating Donald Trump when they themselves are surrounded by people who proudly and loudly declare their hate for everyone on the left. Y'all can't turn a blind eye to that, dear friends over there in Trumptopia. You, as an individual, dear Trumptopian friend, because you are my friend, you're not my enemy. You as an individual might not be full of blind rage for everyone on the left in some insane monolithic way, but you are sitting in the midst of a community in which there is an undeniable plurality of people who do express that level of hate. In a conversation I was having with some folks on the internet recently, I pointed out that the right is openly calling for violence. And they said, no, we are not. That is a leftist lie. Okay, explain to me the 800 open investigations into death threats issued by individuals that proudly self-identify as Trump supporters against election workers, both Republican and Democrat. That's real. That's happening. And if you are a member of the Trumptopian party and you're going to rationalize that away, you are making yourself complicit with violence that comes from those threats. You are empowering those who in your community think it's perfectly fine to issue death threats. Point of order, free speech rights have never protected death threats and threats of violence. Let's be really clear about that. Because I've seen that statement made that free speech somehow protects those who choose to unleash grotesque and irrational threats of violence at their fellow Americans. There's lots of talk on all sides, from all camps, about quote-unquote the agenda. Let me tell you the one thing that people mock and ridicule me for the most and have done so for the longest, and that's this. If there's any one thing that the factual evidence on the ground, people's real life words and actions have proven to me, it's that at the center of whatever the fuck the agenda might be, one thing is certain. Brainwashing Americans into hating their fellow Americans over ideological constructs about how to be an American is at the root of it all. And anyone who turns a blind eye, dismisses it, and convulses themselves into mental pretzels over the dismissal. Oh, I totally lost my turn of phrase there. I was trying to incorporate, bending oneself into a pretzel, and another thing about, irrational rationalizations. But anyone and everyone that turns a blind eye to that sort of thing in their own community, in their own political community, in their own religious community, in their own geographic community, is endangering themselves of becoming complicit in whatever violence gets fomented. This is the dangerous thing about ideologies like that being formed around the Trumptopian narrative. And I'm not going to pretend that Trump is personally responsible for the creation of that ideology. Ideology is created collectively. Rarely, if ever, is it a singular thing drafted and composed by one individual. That was often the case in historical past, but in the world we live in today, ideology is crafted and built and erected and given power collectively. And that includes people who tolerate ideological indoctrination in their own political tribe, which they would not tolerate in the opposition. And I don't see a political party that's free of that issue. If there is one, please show it to me. And I'll giggle really hard if you point to the Democrats or the Republicans. Friends, I say this all with a deep, passionate concern, not just for the people here who live in the United States, but for the world. Because as goes the politics in America, so does it tend to go in other countries. Or it goes in weirdly interesting, correlated, but different directions. Well, that's a whole big, broad statement that I just said that plenty of people will probably poke lots of holes in. Again, none of my statements are to be taken as absolute monoliths. I am a person of nuance. I am well aware that nothing is an individual, nothing is a massive monolith. Nothing is an absolute. In fact, one of my favorite things to point out to people is that absolute statements are very rarely absolutely true. So why is it that Trump and many politicians speak and argue in absolutes? I'm also well aware of the fact that this episode was intended to be a 30 or 45 minute episode and is now running 96 minutes and 56 seconds long. So I will apologize to you for rambling there. Nothing that I ever speak. I can think of one episode where I got a little terse. But even that, as difficult as it can be, was not spoken out of malice or hate. I don't hate anybody. I want to facilitate the healing of the entire human species. And to the best of my understanding, after 30 plus years of seeking, questioning, and thinking critically, it has become clear to me that one of the prerequisite baby steps we must all collectively take together is the transcendence of political ideology. That's a really specific sentence, my dear friends, one that people will try to purposefully misrepresent, misconstrue, or misunderstand. Put a pin in it. We'll have to come back to it another time because I've been rambling long enough. But let me leave you with this final thought. We can't fix the political problems that political ideology created. We can't burn the system down. It will fuck shit up too hard, and nobody, even the hardcore preppers, are really ready for that. No disrespect to the hardcore preppers. You may be much better prepared than many others, but there will be unforeseeable implications. More importantly, and this is a theme I always come back to, it's one of the core pillars, the system wants that violence. The system is goading you and everyone else into violence. Even if you've never believed yourself capable of violence, you have, throughout your entire life, been bombarded by conditioning that prepares you to accept violence as a viable solution for any and every problem. When the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When the only tool you think will solve a problem is a gun, everything becomes a shooting. And the only entity that benefits that is big gun industry. But that's an argument for another day, folks, because everyone's too busy criticizing big pharma. But I digress. Prerequisite baby steps before we even get to the process of transcending the political ideology that we've built for ourselves, the toxic political ideology. Right? And that is setting down and setting aside the ideology that we cling to long enough to engage in the discourse so we can build consensus based on reality. I'll stop repeating myself. As always, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Here's another quick digital asset for your audio entertainment as we wrap this show up. Stray thought that I lost the train of just came back to me, and that's when I was talking about flooding the system. Why do I think the next best immediate step that the American public can possibly take is to flood the system with voting? Because the entire argument presented by the Trumptopians that the system is so brutally riddled with corruption is debunked when voter turnout is maximized and serious, critical, genuine, bipartisan, or preferably nonpartisan review and tallying is conducted. Now, the silent, invisible coup is the fact, what's going on right now is that the Trump base issuing death threats at election officials, irregardless of party. The Trumptopian GOP is pushing people out of those offices and supplanting them with Trump loyalists. The only way I think that I can see for the American public as a whole to put a stop to all of that is for there to be a massive, undeniable blue wave. I realize that the next multiple rounds of elections are going to be contested as Trump and people like him try to repeat the disinformation and the manipulation that they failed to achieve in this last election. And there's plenty of evidence. We already talked about the legislation and the stripping of voting rights, right? And it's undeniable. This is verifiable public record. I'm not making things up here. If there is massive turnout in opposition to the grand old party, which is what GOP stands for, right? In opposition to the Republican Party, beyond the scope of whatever the Democratic base and its coalition base might be. I'm talking to the true silent majority, which is everyone out there that doesn't vote at all and has no political affiliation. Some of those people will vote for Trump, some of those people will not. But if we maximize legal voting participation, I think the harsh reality will bear itself out. And that's that the majority is not in favor of the Republican Party. I could be wrong. I realize that. I could be very wrong. But I would love to see 100% participation by all legally, what's the word? There's a technical term there and it's not coming out. The file not found. All legally eligible voters, right? And I'm sure the first thing they'll say is 5 million, the number of new voters that hadn't voted before, they were all illegal aliens. But I assure you, none of the illegal aliens I know personally in real life give two shits about voting as illegal aliens because they'll get in trouble if they do it and get deported. And the vast majority of illegal aliens, based on my impressions from those that I know and those that I've seen interviewed in public record, they want to become citizens. Just like everybody else's ancestors did. Because ain't nobody on either side that doesn't come from immigrants. But that's a whole episode for another day. For Turkey Day. So that was supposed to be the end of the show and I rambled on for even longer. I think that a massive, legitimate turnout would sort of melt all the arguments away. Especially after numerous recounts. What just happened after the last election? Not only did Trump lose all those court cases, but all of the supposed, what did they call them? Cyber ninjas conducted the audit, and other states replicated that model. Panned out to nothing. They found more fraudulent votes for Trump than for Biden. And that's a verifiable thing. So if we double down on that, and I say we very great, very inclusively, I'm not going to vote. I've never voted. But my political free speech rights give me the right to speak about voting and the electoral process, et cetera, and share my opinion about it. And endorse whoever I damn well feel like. And as much as I normally would not say you got to vote one party down the line, I think that the extreme circumstances call for that kind of legitimate extreme action. And so I invite you in joining in the chorus of everybody who can legally vote should vote. Plenty of people didn't vote in the last election despite all the shenanigans and accusations and drama about it. In fact, it's often comical, but plenty of Trump supporters didn't even vote. Because they don't vote, they just support Trump. Totally allowed. I digress. I'm not suggesting that we should have a blue wave because I want the Democrats to have absolute power. I'm suggesting that we should rally towards 100% participation by all those legally eligible to vote because then all of those loyalists that are being installed will be confronted with that reality and will have to do one of two things. Presuming that my suspicion and my speculative inclination is correct, that people who would vote against Trump outweigh and outnumber, not outweigh, that's grammatically incorrect and also comedically silly sounding, that I suspect, I could be wrong, this is purely speculative, but I suspect, and I'm trying to I'm encouraging the verification of, in real life terms, that if 100% of all legal eligible voters voted, the number who would vote against Trump would outweigh the number of those who would vote for Trump. And that the entire entourage of sycophants would have to confront that reality. And those who've been installed in election official positions of political office would have a fork in the road. They would have to contend with the choice they'd have to make. Own up to the reality that even though they were there to help Trump win, the numbers are overwhelmingly indicative that he lost, or they would have to conduct something similar to the fraudulent slate of electors that 7 states submitted. Now, I've heard the arguments about how they were not fraudulent, and they do not pass muster. Here's why. The Electoral College is many things, and we can have a whole special episode about that. I've got my opinions. But one thing it's not is empowered to willy-nilly replace Electoral College elector slates under the direction of the sitting president, which is apparently what the evidence suggests happened. Yes, states can prepare an alternate slate, especially in the midst of the raw ballot count, in order to be quote-unquote prepared for either outcome, just like how newspapers prepare both headlines. The Democrat one, the Republican one, they set both of those headlines up ahead of time during the count in terms of what's going to get printed. And then they print the one that is the result according to the end of the verification process. So at the core of this is the lie that Vice President Pence had the authority and the power to approve whichever electoral slates he chose. Garbage. To the best of my understanding, that is a false statement. And despite the fact that the Electoral College at each state level has the room to create alternate electors, it does not have the authority or the legal wiggle room to do so under the direction of the sitting president. And that's what they're going to try to do. Although Trump won't be sitting in office anymore, although people somehow irrationally think that he is somehow in some secret bunker, technically in charge, but somehow it's important to let Biden pretend to be in charge for some reason that makes no sense. But that's a whole nother end of the conspiracy theory spectrum of cuckoo crazy that doesn't make sense coming out of that group, right? And I'm not saying the people are cuckoo crazy. What I'm saying is the content that they cling to individually becomes cuckoo crazy when you do a comparative analysis across the tribe, right? Like, how can one tribe believe in so many different things and not stop and go, wait a minute, why? How does that work? But I digress. I will stop here for reals, and I will thank you deeply for tuning in. Your thoughts, comments, reactions, questions, responses are always welcome. If you bring hate speech, you'll be called out for it. If you bring death threats, you'll be reported. And let me close on this final note, because it is symptomatic of the way the Trumptopian movement encourages the base to think. I'm not judging, I'm not casting aspersions, I'm identifying something that is a problematic issue that the Trumptopian base should address. But If you're going to engage in public discourse with me, be advised that I will call you out if your entire contribution to the discussion is nothing but assumptions, projections, blind denials, and adamant claims without backup. If you're going to make an assumption about me, project that assumption onto me, argue that that assumption is true, pat yourself on the back because you assume your assumptions are true, and then celebrate that you owned me in the argument, you're not engaging in civil public discourse with me. You're not even engaging in debate. You're having a conversation with yourself based on pre-scripted talking points that someone spoon-fed to you in an echo chamber that you can't see past, and you will be called out for it. Real critical thinking, real genuine questions will be honored and answered. Malarkey will be called out as malarkey. And with that, friends, I thank you humbly for listening. Please stay tuned for more.
And that is the latest madness from behind the orange wall. Thank you for listening to GMT, a special segment of the Almost Daily ZenCast. Stay woke, Trumptopia. Stay woke.